Alright, this is the second part of the second series of my world building guide on cultural world building for populating our Earth-like fantasy world with realistic cultures and people. I'll get better at figuring out what that intro needs to be. But this blog series is also coupled with a physical blog on my website, which I will link below. And in this part, we are going to briefly touch on initial human migration across the globe and the impact that this has on the diversity of large mammals. And this will come into play in the next part where we talk about animal domestication and animal husbandry, providing some advantages and disadvantages in different parts of your world. So this methodology is highly based on the natural evolution and migration of humans as we see on Earth. If your world would have experienced something similar, you should be able to follow this exactly. And as this is fantasy though, if you have a unique creation method explaining where humans or magical creatures came from, you will have to keep that in mind and adjust this process accordingly. So, mapping human migration. Human evolution would happen on a similar time frame in an Earth-like fantasy world. So if we figure out the rough migration paths of humans, we can determine the impact on large mammals. More on why later. But this is not required, but I think this step adds a little bit of variation to our worlds. If you really don't want to dive into this part, you can probably just skip this whole part. But if you want to have a little bit more diversity and challenges in your world, then proceed. Due to the fact that we aren't going to dive into paleoclimatology over the last few million years in our world while charting the sea levels, traversable areas, and climate zones, this whole section is going to be a lot of gut feeling and maybes. Also, you may have other ways that humans or other fantasy creatures began to populate your planet. Perhaps there were portals from another realm, perhaps the gods created humans in the spot their realm is closest to, perhaps each fantasy creature would have evolved in a different environment and their migration would have been limited. But let's proceed with an Earth-like human evolution and migration process, So first we are going to choose the birthplace of humanity. And this is going to be a rough area, not an exact spot. The apes that human evolved from lived on the ground, not in trees, and recent research is showing they likely lived mainly in grasslands with gallery forests near rivers. The climate and biomes would have been vastly different at the time that humanity became humanity, right? But look for an area that could roughly support that. There are different theories on Earth's birthplace of humanity, such as being in Botswana or Ethiopia, but they really don't know for sure, and it honestly might not even be a single birthplace based off some of the research I've read. So just pick somewhere between 30 degrees north and south with reasonable likelihood of having rivers. This should be pretty reasonable though. So if you look on my map, I picked the westernmost continent as the birthplace for humanity, where I expect there to be pretty significant sort of like river valleys, and I think that could have likely been more grassland back, you know, many tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So that is the spot I picked. And honestly, to an extent, pick a spot, right? And go with it. So the next step is going to be drawing our migration paths. And humans would have followed the land, mainly coasts and along rivers where they would have had a water source as they migrated. The exact topography and coastlines would have been different at this time, so don't worry about this too much. And I included one of the better migration paths I could find to give you an idea of what you're going for, but something to note between all these graphics I show here and what you'll find online is that there are a lot of differing theories. There's a lot of new research coming out, so like every few years they'll discover more things or have new technology to be able to look at previous finds and get more precise numbers or new numbers. So all the numbers are going to be a little bit different, but the ones that I'm going to actually state and the ones I have in my blog are from the most recent research and articles I could find about this. So it's the most accurate ones I can find, but some of these graphics don't exactly line up with that. Just keep that in mind. But you can look at your plate tectonic map and underwater elevation maps if you have them. We don't make those in my guide. I know some other guides do. And if you see any land bridges would have been created that humans could have followed, you can do that. I have a way that I look for those without actually having the, like, sea sea elevation maps, seafloor elevation maps done, which I'll help you with later if you don't have that. But humans also used coastal boats or canoes pretty early on, so they could have crossed small distances, followed island chains, but they wouldn't cross large open oceans at first. If you have any land masses that are completely disconnected from the rest, humans likely wouldn't have been able to reach them unless there were glaciers or ice sheets they could follow. Look at your last glacial maximum that we mapped way back then. There's a theory that 50,000 years ago, humans may have been capable of Stone Age open ocean sailing at this point. I have an article in the blog post link that you can look at. So that is also something to consider for later migration. And basically you just want to draw the paths along the main migration paths, similar to what you sort of see in this map. So here are the migration paths I mapped, and I apologize if this is hard to see, but the gray, dark gray lines are my migration paths, and you can see faintly my plate boundaries behind this. But none of my separate land masses are on the same continental shelf. They're all a little bit further apart, which limits land bridge potential. But what I did was decide that the seafloor would be shallow enough along some of my convergent boundaries to create a bit of land bridge to connect some of the continents. So where I marked land bridge crossings, that's essentially where I think that, you know, when the sea was shallower and more water was contained up in ice sheets and that sort of a thing, humans would have been able to cross there, perhaps cross while jumping across smaller bits of water, sort of like through little island chains. And other areas I'm saying would be crossable by early canoes, which is where I marked as sea crossings. So you can see we started in that westernmost continent. They went north up from there, some split off, northeast, followed a bit of land bridge, a bit of a sea crossing, a bit more land bridge to get into that northern continent, and some went northwest where it's actually pretty close to that other continent on the opposite side of my globe, so I'm saying a sea crossing is feasible there. And then from there they went south, and from my easternmost continent I'm saying there was a bit of a land bridge connecting where you already see that sort of island archipelago chain, which is due to the convergent boundaries. That's not that main arc of it isn't from like hotspots or volcanoes, that's actually from the earth being pushed up. So I think it's very feasible that there's a lot more land there, that if sea levels dropped, people could have just walked on across and then eventually by sea made that last jump to my southernmost continent. So now we are going to label these areas by migration distance. And we want to make a map that indicates the migration time that looks sort of similar to this map here. But the distinctions we are going to look at are co-evolved and little impact on large mammals, early migration with some impact, and distant migration with extreme impact. And some of you may also have a no migration area, and I have another type of migration area I had to add on my map, which we'll talk about later, but co-evolved, which is no impact, is essentially the direct area around the birth of civilization, and close by areas with similar climates. These are going to be where all of the animals co-evolved alongside humans. Early migration, which is some impact, is going to be areas adjacent to the co-evolved area that would take a bit more time to reach. This is sort of be your equivalent to the Middle East, India, some of Europe. Distant migration, which is extreme impact, are going to be the farther reaches of land separated by more difficult terrain like mountains, deserts, rainforests, and land separated and only reachable by open ocean crossings of land bridges with lower sea levels. This is going to be like your Americas, Australia. And then no migration, which is no impact yet. This is going to be land separated by large open oceans with no possibility for connection with land bridges and little to no possibility of even early open ocean crossing, canoes and boats being able to cross that distance. So this is what my map looked like. And if your map looks like mine, I actually included a very distant migration level instead of a no migration level. This would be a migration level for probably within the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. The Americas are, I think it's about 12,000 years ago that the most modern Homo sapiens reached there. We'll get to that more later. But that's sort of when people would have reached my easternmost continent. So at the time that they fully like proliferated through that entire continent, made it through that lower island chain, crossed through that to that lower continent, we're looking maybe the last 1,000 to 2,000 years, which is a bit complicated, right? And I'll get into that more later. But let's talk about the availability of large domestic animals. And this is sort of a little bit deep dive of mine. You can probably, I don't know, I think it's really interesting. And if you're here, you probably do too. So we're going to talk about what makes an animal domesticable and what the major domesticable animals are. But for now, all you need to know is that not every animal can be domesticated, and the ones that are useful for different things. In the equivalent Earth timeframe we are mapping, Africa and Eurasia were the only continents with most of the large domesticable animals. This is before the Columbian Exchange, where we saw a major swap of Old and New World plants and animals that brought horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, which are the major 5, sneak peek, to the Americas. Before this, South America also had domesticated llamas, which could be used as a pack animal, and then there's some other smaller domesticated animals like alpacas, turkeys, ducks, bees, guinea pigs, dogs, a few others. And this time is also before the colonization of Australia in the late 1700s that brought pigs, chickens, sheep, horses, and cattle to Australia. And before this, the only animal that was mostly domesticated was perhaps the dingo. So the lack of domesticable animals makes civilization growth a lot harder. Without animals that can pull a heavy plow, agriculture can be less efficient. Without mounts or strong animals that can pull wheeled vehicles, travel's much slower and civilizations have trouble being as centralized. Without livestock for meat, civilizations may have to rely on hunting, which can be less efficient. And notice all of these cans and mays, right? There are other ways to solve these problems, and you can get really interesting cultures and civilizations by doing so, but in terms of the base advantages, right, this sort of default things that they would have accessible to them, right, is going to differ. So you can have advanced civilizations without beasts of burden, of course. The Aztecs never had any, and the Incas only had llamas, which couldn't really be used for heavy loads. And still, the size, number, and density of civilizations in places without many domesticable animals, especially beasts of burden, were clearly impacted, right? The types of societies that could flourish without beasts of burden is a smaller set than those that can flourish with them. Evolution is a slow process, and the ancestors of many domesticable animals across the globe can be traced back to animals that were found when the continents were all attached into one large supercontinent. And because of this, you tend to see more similar animals in different continents based off how recently they were connected and how recent of ancestors they shared. And so I went through a whole deep dive, and the people that are in my Discord will know the strange directions I went in at first, but I expected, just based off that, not knowing much about what actually happened, right, to see similar numbers of domesticable animals in similar regions around the world, right? That's what I expected. And so from a world building perspective, I was asking the questions of, okay, well, you know, why weren't there many domesticable animals in the Americas? Did the cultures there just choose not to domesticate what they had available? Were the animals not able to be domesticated? Like, why were they not there? Like, that seems weird. Is there something geographical that we can look at as a pattern that we can apply to our own worlds for why you wouldn't develop, you know, domesticable animals? You don't want to know how much time I spent Googling this. I subscribed to a number of scientific journals just so I could read the recent research on all of this, and yes, let's get into it. So it used to be the case that all of these domesticable animals, you know, looking at their ancestors, were everywhere. There were native horses, cattle, sheep, and goats, and likely other domesticable animals in North America. Prehistoric species, at least. However, they all went extinct at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, along with mammoths, giant beavers, mastodons, lion, giant ground sloths, many more. Over 60 different megafauna species went extinct. And quick note, we are going to talk about megafauna, which sometimes refers to the largest size category of large animals and sometimes refers to some larger groups, but the extinctions that we're talking about are for megafauna and other large fauna, right? But it was more extreme the larger they got. So just those terms are used here a little bit interchangeably. Yes. So there were multiple horse species, one of which actually evolved in North America, migrated to other continents, namely Eurasia across the land bridge. Then they went extinct in North America during this extinction. And when the Europeans came back for the Columbian Exchange and reintroduced horses to America, some of those were the animals that had evolved in North America. Right? That's crazy. It's crazy. There's also a cattle similar to modern yaks. There was steppe bison, the Dall mountain sheep, Harrington mountain goats, a camel that was closely related to llamas, and a lot more in North America. South America had plenty of these as well, horses, camels, etc. And so the question is clearly less of where would we have found these animals, where would they have evolved, but where did they go extinct? And I do not think this is something that you have to include in your mapping. Again, you can definitely come up with a lot of reasons for why you wouldn't have a huge recent megafauna extinction, but it is something I like to consider. So we are going to. So the quaternary, we're just gonna go with that. Megafauna extinction is an event that happened from 52 to 9000 BCE during the last glacial period, where a large number of megafauna and bigger animals went extinct. And by a large number, I do mean a large number. In the article Late Quaternary Extinction, State of the Debate by Paul L. Koch and Anthony D. Barnosky, pronunciations, which will be linked in the blog post, they share a lot of the most recent calculations and finding on this topic that is continuing to grow and evolve pretty rapidly every single year. But the percentage of species that went extinct by continent, looking at animals bigger than roughly 97 pounds or 44 kilograms, is 21% in Africa, 35% in Eurasia, 72% in North America, 83% in South America, and 88% in Australia. And you can see in this graphic here, which is from a different source, so their thresholds are a little bit different. This is looking at extinctions for over 10 kilograms or 22 pounds, so this is a bit more broad. But you can see there's some interesting patterns here, right? Like these extinctions were significantly more impactful in the areas that we didn't see a lot of domesticable animals. So these extinction events across the globe were not all happening at the same time either. Some took tens of thousands of years, while others only took a few thousand, like the Americas. Seems odd, right? The exact reasoning is still very hotly debated, with new findings coming out pretty often, but at a high level, I think it's pretty clear. There is one common event triggering these extinctions for all but one continent, which we will get into later, and that is humans. Us. There are a lot of theories and explanations for the cause of the quaternary megafauna extinction, but the most likely cause is a combination of climate change and human activity. So climate change would have made things harder for these species, as they have to rapidly adapt to a changing environment, changing food sources, etc. And then the introduction of humans brought hunting, large fires, competition for resources, etc., which altogether led to the extinction of so many animals. And I would recommend reading the article I mentioned before if you want to know more about the research and theories. I've read dozens of articles and sources about this, and I think that is the most comprehensive one that kind of really gets into everything and looking at different places around the world. It's a long read. It's not the most difficult academic read. It's not the easiest either, but like I think it's attainable if you're semi-used to reading scientific articles. And just to give you an idea of what the world looked like at this point, you can see this graphic here. Yes, for reconstructed vegetation cover at the last glacial maximum period, which is roughly 18,000 years ago. And just for reference, megafauna seem to have tended to prefer like steppe and grassland habitats, which sort of made sense. They were huge, right? So to work backwards, right? Let's start at the last continent that humans migrated to. It was only about 13 to 15,000 years ago that humans reached the Americas. And after 8,000 years or so of really getting established, moving across the entire continents, 72% of the largest animal species went extinct. Humans, or Homo sapiens, were very evolved when they got to the Americas, more than capable of advanced hunting techniques and tools. Their arrival was extremely disruptive, evident in how quick the extinctions happened. Before the Americas, humans reached Australia about 50 to 60,000 years ago, and they were pretty efficient hunters when they reached Australia, but perhaps not as advanced as when they reached the Americas 40 to 50,000 years later. The extinctions in Australia took a bit longer, occurring between 33 and 50,000 years ago. And Eurasia is a bit more complicated, right? Humans have lived here for 2 million years, but the first humans that migrated out of Africa were Homo erectus, followed by the Neanderthals, then the Denisovans, and other early Homo sapiens. But Homo sapiens sapiens, the more anatomically modern subspecies of Homo sapiens that are our direct ancestors, which were more advanced than the more archaic subspecies that migrated into Eurasia first, and had more diverse diets and advanced tools. And their arrival into Eurasia seemed to have coincided with the start of the wave of extinctions there. So mammals had been living alongside various Homo species for over 1 million years. So they weren't nearly as disrupted by the entry of more advanced human hunters than they were in the Americas or Australia. It is even possible that climate changes were a bigger cause of the extinctions here than in other continents where humans played a bigger factor. And now, Africa was the least impacted continent, but humans have also been there the longest, obviously. And most of the possible explanations revolve around the fact that animals in Africa evolved alongside humans. And there are a few main theories for this, right? So first, the animals that co-evolved around humans had evolved to have defense mechanisms that made them harder for humans to hunt, right? Like, those were their natural predators, and they evolved to survive. The ones that could best evade humans survived the best, right? So this would have led to human populations not being able to grow as quickly and keeping them more in balance with the larger animal populations. And as a related note, the animals that co-evolved with humans in Africa tend to be less domesticable, like how zebras are too aggressive to be domesticated by humans, unlike horses, which could be due to the defense mechanisms that they developed to protect them from humans in the first place. This is a little bit theory that kind of occurred to me as a pattern, but I think it makes sense, right? The second theory that could also be a big factor is that parasites and pathogens also evolved alongside humans in Africa, making them more adapted to affecting humans than the parasites and pathogens in other parts of the world would have been. So this could have also contributed to keeping the human population small enough to not overhunt the large mammal species and to keep everything in balance. Again, this is all hotly debated. There's a lot of new research coming out about this very frequently as the technology that allows us to do like carbon dating and look at samples and just kind of get better timelines of what kind of happened throughout human history, right, gets better. So it's something to follow if you think it's interesting. So we want to map extinction events, and we want to map the areas where we would have had more significant extinction events, thus fewer large animals, and thus less domesticable animals. And this is an extreme simplification. So feel free to pick and choose what effects you really want if you choose to go through with this process at all. The areas you want to be assigning these levels should be pretty large, basically continents, because we need to look at areas where you wouldn't expect animals to easily migrate back into, such as how, like in Europe, there's a pretty large extinction event, but also a lot of the mammals in, you know, Eurasia or other parts of Asia and stuff could kind of just like migrate and readapt to that area where that was less possible in Australia or the Americas. So I have 4 levels here that we're going to map. Extreme extinction event, and this is low to no large domesticable beasts of burden. This is essentially your Americas, your Australia. Minor extinction event. This is almost all possible large domesticable beasts of burden went extinct. This is going to be areas with early migration, think Eurasia. Then there's going to be no extinction event, which is all possible large domesticable beasts of burden. We don't have this on Earth, but this would be if you had an area that had no migration, right? Humans never touched it. And then coevolution, which is a few large megafauna, but few to none large domesticable beasts of burden, and this is going to be areas where humans would have co-evolved with animals. So, in the case of my map, where I also have a very distant migration area within the last 1 to 2,000 years, that is going to be well within remembered human history, right? The group of people that would have reached my southern continent would probably be the seafaring people from the nearby islands, people that came from that easternmost continent, and they should have been more than capable of agriculture and have had domesticated animals of their own, although they might have been largely reliant on fishing given where they came from. But the question is, would they overhunt the animals there? Would they set off a ton of fires? How disruptive would they be? Would they have caused all these animal species to go extinct? This is one of the cases where it would largely be dependent on the culture of the people that settled there and how they were used to getting their food. And I think there would have been some amount of extinction, but I think these would have been a people that didn't need to rely as heavily on hunting or gathering, and they would have leaned more on agriculture instead, and they would have already known when they arrived here, if they saw similar animals to what they were used to, that, oh, these could probably be domesticated. We could use these animals for the things our ancestors say have been using them for, right? So it takes about 10 generations for animals to become domesticated, which is certainly within the time frame of human arrival on the southern continent. So domesticable animals probably would have been domesticated, right? They would have arrived, they would have taken advantage to what they've seen, and they probably would have had a large extinction effect on wild populations. But I think they would have probably also pulled in a lot of those animals that could have been used to themselves as well, right? And they also would have probably brought along domesticated animals of their own, which would have caused turmoil in the food chain. So with that, I'm going to label this area as minor extinction, meaning that there's still going to be a good number of domesticable animals present in civilizations, but I do think that under the covers there would have been a lot of disruption and extinction going on in the food chain. So, final thoughts. We've mapped out our human migration and determined how the resulting extinction events affected the availability of domesticable animals. And in the next few parts, we're going to be looking at agriculture and other major impacts on culture so that we can basically figure out what challenges would have been seen in different geophysical regions, what advantages would they have had, what kind of cultural impacts would we likely have seen due to these, and then we can kind of make choices to do weird things places, you know, to get some unique things. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you have any questions, let me know. There are references and other links in the blog post, and yeah, I will see you in the next one.